Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Distinguished Speaker Series. I'd like to thank Mrs. Vernal once again, over and over, for putting this together. It's a sort of multi-part event that we have with Peter. As you know, we're going to his opening. Well, the opening has already happened, but we're going to Gallery Naga at the end of the month to see his paintings and to hear a talk by him again at lunch. So if you're interested in doing that, it's in the calendar, and please do sign up for it. Thank you for everybody who's filming this today with CCTV. We have about 50 of our programs now on cable TV, so anytime you want to get more of Newbury Court, just turn on Channel 8 and you can see our programs. So, and thank you, Betsy, for arranging all this, and Tamar from Channel 8. Anyway, today our speaker, Peter Brooke, as many of you already know, is from Concord, so welcome home. He went to the Fen School and then to Middlesex. He received his Bachelor of Fine Arts from Denison University in Ohio in 1983, and his Master of Fine Arts from the Mount Royal School of Art at Maryland Institute College of Art in 1987. In 1992, Gallery Naga, and by the way, we have Meg White from Gallery Naga here with us today, so thank you for coming. Gallery Naga featured Peter for his first two solo exhibitions, which began a 25-year relationship between him and the gallery. In 2001, the Boston Globe selected his installation, Any Tree, Any Rock, Any Hill, at Gallery Naga for its top 10 list of the best art shows for the year. In 2011, American Artist magazine included Peter on their 11 artists to watch list. Peter's work is in many private, public, and corporate collections, both nationally and internationally, and notably in the permanent collections of the Yale University Art Gallery, the MFA in Boston, and the Harvard Art Museums. From his home studio in North Pomfret, Vermont, Peter paints dreamlike scenes of the natural world based on memory and personal experience. In doing so, he pushes the boundaries of conventional landscape painting by capturing the feeling of being with the land, rather than merely representing it. Peter's new book, Nature of Memory and Experience, is here for purchase after the talk, and of course, Peter will also sign copies. Please welcome Peter Brooke.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As some of you might remember, I was here a little while ago with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, of which I am a serving board member, and I was introduced to these events through that, so I knew what I was up against. I wanted to thank Brigadier Grineau. Thank you so much for inviting me in the first place, and then pushing me to keep on track, which was a helpful thing. And Jesse, thank you for all your efforts as well. And of course, I want to thank my father for being such a swell guy. and backing me up over the years. When I thought about talking with you today, I was casting about for an approach to present my work, and I thought really the best way to start would be to take you through the physical process of constructing a painting from soup to nuts. And I'm not a traditional plein air painter. I don't go outside and set up my easel. Rather, I spend a lot of time outside. Sometimes I take a notebook with me. Most often I do not. I like to really separate my experiencing of the subject matter that I'm interested in. I really like to ingest that and let it gestate and kick around for a while, and then hopefully through an intellectual process of reconjuring the landscape, I tend to go through a series of paintings, sometimes small, sometimes large, and as the paintings begin to develop, one painting that's in my studio on the wall might inform another painting. There might be a referential point, and then the ball gets rolling with a series of work. But first and foremost, for me, place is very important. I'm essentially a landscape painter, so the landscape in which I live right now in North Pomfret, Vermont, is a pastoral kind of storybook type landscape. Much the way my memories of Concord was in my youth, where I could walk from Lindsay Pond Road, I could walk into town, traveling through the woods and through the fields. It would be hard to do that anymore, but I can do that in the town that I live in right now, and I enjoy the open space and I enjoy the natural world, so it gives me a lot of information to work with. So I'm going to take you through a series of slides of my studio. This is my studio. I built it in 2000. Before that, I had a smaller kind of shed that I worked in, and I built this with a friend. And essentially, it's a north-facing. I have indirect light, and as you can see, I really like gardens, so I do a lot of gardening and working in the space as well. This is my shop, the entry to my shop, and I don't paint on canvas. I paint on wood panels, and it's a birch panel. And so the construction of the panel is very important. The process in which I prepare the surface is extremely important. So I mill up poplar to back the paintings with, and I attach just with glue, no nails, the poplar to the superstructure of the painting, and then I set, after the panels are, as I'm constructing them one at a time, and then in a group, I then start to apply a traditional gesso, and it's a water-based medium, and I'm very meticulous about my surfaces, so this takes me a long time. I probably do 8 to 12 layers of gesso, sanding in between each layer, and really making a nice surface that will absorb the paint in a particular way. Gesso is made up of a silicate that naturally will absorb oil paint, and I want the surface to be quite clean and almost glass-like before I start painting. So this panel is probably third or fourth layer. It's a little bit not mind-numbing when I do this because it's just complete process. So I listen to books on tape, and that gets me through it. And at the same time, I also paint on paper as well. So I'll take a heavy watercolor paper, and I will gesso those at the same time that I'm doing the panel. And so once I've processed maybe 20 to 25 panels, I will also have 20 to 25 sheets of paper to work on as well. In addition, with Naga, I show at a gallery in Philadelphia called Dolan Maxwell, and they show only work on paper. And I have made prints for them in the past, but I really prefer to paint directly on paper, which I've been doing now with them since around 1998. Then I have a large sheet of glass on a moving palette, and I lay out my colors. And what I tend to do is work with one or two paint manufacturers. I don't grind my own pigments, but I don't use anything straight from the tube. I tend to mix 3 or 4 colors to get the color that I'm particularly interested in. There are traditional methods and materials and techniques which painters have been using for years. I was just actually lamenting this with a fellow painter of mine. I never took a traditional materials course, so I was never taught how to mix colors. Most of the teachers that I had in undergraduate were abstract expressionists. They were mainly interested in using paint as paint and having paint express itself. And so I just was handed a bunch of stuff and was told to go out and use it. So most of my color sense, and I did take a few color theory courses, but most of my additions and subtractions of color comes really through trial and error, which has been a long, it's been a lot of error. So the other thing that I do is I have a medium that I mix in with my paint, and I use a linseed oil, which is a stand linseed oil. It's a very thick, viscous oil. Traditionally, it was, I think, sun thickened, and now it is actually manufactured by heating the linseed oil up and polymerizing it. And it's very viscous and thick. It's difficult to work with. And so I thin it with a type of turpentine, and then I add a little bit of a dryer to accelerate the drying process. I can generally work on one piece for between, at the longest, between 8 and 12 hours a session before the paint starts to harden up. So I tend to paint in layers because of that. So I will create something that is referred to as a glaze. And a glaze is a transparent, a relatively transparent, thin layer of paint. And I will work glaze upon glaze upon glaze. So the final result, the painting, and when we look at the paintings, I'll describe that more clearly. Final result is most of the white that you're seeing is actually the white of the gesso coming through those layers. I do add white in the painting process, but a lot of the luminosity of the color is being pushed by the white that's actually coming from behind the application of paint. And when I paint in a subtractive manner, so I'm adding paint and pulling the paint off at the same time, and allowing and kind of drawing with the brush in order to make the form come out, almost in a negative fashion, in a negative space way. And we'll process through that as well. I work on a north-facing wall sometimes. I will use artificial light. I like to work under natural light. It really depends on the day. And in terms of how I work, as I said, I have a lot of paintings going on at the same time. There are multiple layers are kind of happening as I process through each image. And in this particular one, I'm working on a painting, and what I'm doing there is I'm probably subtracting some of the paint off of the back layer of trees of that particular painting. That's what it looks like I'm doing, at least. In addition to just having the paintings work with one another in kind of a concerted and a concert format, I also will refer to journals and to other drawings that I've done in a referential way. A lot of times, my paintings are inspired by something that I've seen, and I'll go back through my books to see if I have other references to that particular image, and and quite invariably I do, and I will use that as source material. The same with something like this. I have when my son was going to the bus stop every day, I had a book of bus stop drawings that from dropping him off and picking him up, and we'd go there and wait for the bus, and I would do some drawings, and then when I'd pick him up in the afternoon, I would do afternoon drawings. It was so I have multiple books of a lot of bus stop images, and it's almost the same image over and over and over again, but I end up using them, which is great. And then in addition, I do a lot of sumi ink drawings, and I mix between traditional Japanese sumi ink with a big brush, and then also I will take powdered graphite, and I will just mix powdered graphite with water and use it in the same way. And I do a fair amount of these sketches as well. Kind of transferring the idea of, rather than a straight graphic drawing, transferring the idea and thought process into using a brush and using washes to express the kind of tonal relationships that I want to build up on a particular piece. This is a studio wall shot of a group of paintings that were completely finished and I was ready to ship off. This was for a show in New York a little over a year ago, and so you can see I have a broad variety of shapes and sizes. I tend to choose the subject matter to coincide with a particular size, and sometimes, strangely enough, on the far side there's some smaller pieces there, and those are 12 by 24 inches, and they're of the largest landscape that I think I've ever tried to make, and it's these broad views of the Front Range in northern Montana, which I've spent a fair amount of time visiting and hiking through and fishing and observing and doing some drawings. And I felt that it was a really great challenge to try to fit this massive prairie Front Range image into a very small piece. I'm fairly obsessive about how I transport my paintings, so I build all my own boxes, and these box. I have one over here. They close like a book, and nothing will get damaged. So I go through that. That's another mind-numbing thing. So that's when the books come back out. The books on tape come back out, and I spend a couple weeks building these boxes. Then the boxes go into the back of my pickup truck. That pickup truck gets all put together, and then I take them and deliver them to the gallery. Most importantly, if I'm making work that's largely constructed in my mind, in my mind's eye, in terms of how I'm perceiving the landscape, what's most important is for me to consider how memory functions and how we hold things in our mind's eye, and what that does to not only the form, but a true understanding of how landscape can function in the subconscious. Now, I was brought up in Concord. I spent a lot of time gazing out of the Fenn School windows when I was a kid, not wanting to be there and just wanting to be outdoors. Over the years, I've taken that same kind of daydreamy personality, and I've processed it in a way in which I can make paintings pretty easily by conjuring up places that I've been to, that I certainly know and I've spent a lot of time in. the first places that I really got out and started to look into were areas in northern New England, in the Adirondacks, in the White Mountains and in the Green Mountains, hiking and camping and exploring. And so there's an important part of me that finds a place to use the mountain as an image. And again, I'm going to go back to that because I've working on a series of paintings called Mountains of the Mind, and in terms of how our subconscious holds these kind of these monumental forms and how we process them. Again, another image. You'll see that these have all my family in them because much like my father, I spend pretty much all my free time, if I can, with my kids and my wife, and we like to go off and do a lot of things together. This was in the Tetons. It's actually looking at the Tetons from across the valley. This was a mountain that drains on both sides of the Continental Divide, and it's a great place to actually look at the Grand Teton and also get to dip your feet into both watersheds of this great country. This particular image is from a great trip that I took in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is in northern Montana. It's the largest wilderness area in the United States. We visited just one small section of it. It's just an absolutely gigantic and beautiful area, and we were there for 8 days, and we saw nobody except for our group. We had 3 families with us and a guide, and a pack train of horses and all our equipment, and it was a really fun trip. This is a picture of a friend's ranch that's also outside of Augusta, Montana, same area, and it's an area that I've spent a lot of time in, hiking and doing a lot of drawings. I've done a lot of paintings. There's actually a painting in the show at Naga right now that is of this same particular butte. This is a photo, yeah. I wish it was a painting. Then I spent a lot of time on the water. This is with my son, paddling in northern Michigan. I've been painting a lot of marshland paintings, and a lot of the time that I spend in the boat looking for dragonflies and birds. I also look aesthetically pretty carefully at the atmosphere that's created in these extraordinary places. My wife and I own a cottage in northern Michigan, so we spend a lot of time on Lake Michigan, northern Lake Michigan, day sailing mainly, and kayaking and swimming, and we are usually there for about 2 weeks in the summer. So you'll see a lot of paintings also that reference Lake Michigan as well. I spend usually one trip a year in the Adirondacks, usually hiking or paddling with friends. I have a friend that builds Adirondack guide boats, and he always has some very amazing places to go and see. And this one particular place I've done a lot of paintings of. That flat area in the upper left is actually it's an 8-acre floating bog. It's entirely floating, and it has trees growing on them. It's filled with pitcher plants, bog cotton. They're incredible environments, and you can actually kayak into these, right into the bog. And the amazing thing is that you can circumnavigate the entire thing, and it's historically moved in this area. It's called Lowe's Lake, where this is, which is just off the Racket River. And this particular bog, over the last, I think, 60 years, has wedged itself into the northwestern corner. It was in the southeastern corner, but it's slowly been pushed by the wind and the currents into its current place. An incredible microenvironment. And then I spend a good chunk of my winter in the woods or in the mountains skiing, and usually once a year I like to do a ski mountaineering trip if I can. This year I did go out west with my son, but we didn't do any mountaineering because he has not done any avalanche training. But the trips that I have done more recently, because I'm smarter than I used to be, are guided, and I have really taken on the love for an area in British Columbia, north of Nelson, British Columbia. It was kind of central British Columbia, and I'm hoping to go back there this year. And there are a couple pictures I have of this particular this particular area. And this is Jasmine Caton, who's our guide there, and she grew up there, and it's really amazing to have her guide us all around her backyard. Her parents were ski guides, and it's all non-mechanical. We're all climbing the whole time and visiting these amazing landscapes. So this is where I live. This is at the top of the hill above my house. This is a great place where, as a family, we've had many picnics and cocktails with my mom and dad. It's a place, from this particular view, it's a place where about 4 trails come together, and pretty much everyone in the neighborhood will show up at one point or another if you're up there. And it's a place that I have made just countless paintings of. And I know the view so well, and I'll come back to this particular image later on. This is my home. This is your kind of typical sugar maple hedge that's all around us, that I find to be incredible small microenvironments. And the other mind-numbing thing I do is cut and stack wood. And I do this, and I'll paint for 5 or 6 hours, and when things aren't going well, I'll go back out and stack wood, and then I'll go back to work. But this is a great kind of, stacking wood is as much of the process helping me get through my thoughts for that particular day as banging my head against the wall trying to make something work. This is the pond that's right across the road from us. I've made a lot of referential paintings to this particular pond. And then in addition, a high school friend of mine and I own 100 acres in the Central Green Mountains, and we have a little cabin and a sauna house, and it's 4 miles in on a non-mechanical road. We can get a 4-wheeler up there, but it's completely off the grid, and I spend a fair amount of time there as well. A lot of looking, a lot of bird watching, and this is our meadow. I've made a lot of paintings of this meadow. That's the camp house. I think that's my kid's tent. And this is the typical hardwood forest that I'm pretty obsessed with. This particular forest, we've owned the place for now almost 20 years, and we've been cutting and tending this particular wood lot, and we have some really beautiful, real champion maple trees that we could certainly cut and process if we wanted to, but we're really not planning on it. And then this is the top of our hill. So now on to the important stuff. This is a studio shot right now. This is just, probably took this picture just before I started packing work up for my recent show. The painting in the foreground is a triptych painting called Mountains of the Mind. It's 3 separate mountain ranges that I brought together. The one on the far right is my memory of being in New Mexico. The one in the center is of British Columbia, and the one on the left is in the Tetons. And I'm not looking at any pictures, I'm just merely thinking of these places as I experienced them when I was there, and then I was planning on making 3 separate paintings, and I ended up attaching all 3 together, and it's really a really strong, good, solid piece. The paintings in the background also are all in the current show as well. In terms of subject matter, I in the past I think I was probably fooling myself to think that I was so overly influenced by one particular spot, whether it was my backyard or whether it was a trip to Ireland or a residency in Maine. And I've come to find out that my paintings are more general, they're less specific. You can certainly look at one of my paintings and think, oh, well, that looks like a New England sky, which is fine, but in terms of the topography, I'm much more interested in kind of the general characterization of a place. And so each of these categories are things that my images tend to follow. So the first one would be trees. These are beech trees. Second one, mountains, obviously. This is an image of the Tetons. This is, I think, 36 by 48 inches, or 36 by 50 inches. Water, obviously. I spend a fair amount of time on Lake Michigan. I have a lot of paintings that reference my time in various boats. Hilltops tend to be paintings that refer to my time in and around Pomfret in central Vermont. This is I think a 50 by 50 painting, and so this is probably as good a painting as any in which I can kind of tell you about the process of how I'm working. So all of those yellows and umber colors that you're seeing are actually coming, that's the white that's projecting through the transparent layers of the paint. So as I add paint on, I might take a series of colors, maybe 6 or 7 colors that I'll add together, and I'll paint a broad wash across the base of the painting. And then if I want darker hues, I'll add darker hues. And then if I want highlights to start coming through, then I will start taking the brush and carving away at the paint and allow for color and the transparent nature of color and light to project forward. So it's a very untraditional way of painting, rather than adding white to the paint to create a lighter color value. I'm actually subtracting pigment in order for those lighter color values to be projected forward. And what I found with that process is not only can I be kind of sculptural in terms of the way I'm taking the paint away and making the form emerge out of kind of an amorphous state, but it creates transparency in the layers, and it creates a relationship in the multiple layers of the paint. And it also creates a certain amount of ambiguity that also conjures up this sense of how memory functions, because all of our memories function in hazy and sharp ways. We might remember something specifically, but there are these hazy edges that also coexist. And as I am processing and making the paintings, there are areas that are sharp, and then there are areas that are fuzzy. And that, to me, is a perfect example of how my memory works. There are a series of paintings that I also love to do, which tend to be about the interior of the forest, about glacial erratics, rocks, and cellar holes, and then just open woodlands. This is a particular piece I did after a residency that I did in Maine at Acadia National Park at the Richard Estes Foundation. Richard Estes was a photo realist painter, and he hosts one artist a year for just an incredible residency. He gives you a beautiful house, and he just lets you do your thing. And I had never been to Acadia, and I had been to Maine, but not to Acadia, and I got to spend 2 months there just looking and drawing and making paintings. I did a lot of paintings on paper, and then I came back and I made a whole series of pieces about this one particular spot. Hedgerows also are another really, to me, a great subject matter to work with. They divide the picture plane into different layers. You can look through them. There's a lot of life in a hedgerow. They're dividing lines in the way we look at things, and they also are a great thing to function in terms of the scale of objects, things being in the foreground and things being in the extreme distance. You're always trying to find a way through a hedgerow, so it's another a really good thing to process. And this is not a picture of my particular pond, but this is one of many paintings I've done of ponds. It's a pretty big piece, I think. I think it was maybe 60 inches by something, not 100% sure. And I think probably of all the images that I've done, the paintings of ponds most clearly refer back to my memory of growing up on Lindsay Pond Road, which I spent just a lot of time mucking about in the water down there. That whole Spencer Brook Valley area in Concord, Bateman's Pond, Hutchins Pond, all the various ponds in Concord, all of those things tend to come back when I decide to make a painting of a body of water. So I'm not entirely, go back to that, I'm not entirely sure where that is, but it's definitely a combination of a lot of ponds that I've been to.
One silly question.
Yeah.
Watercolor or oil?
Sorry, yes, they're all oil.
They are?
Yes, yeah, yeah. And I paint somewhat like a watercolor painter in that sense, in that I'm allowing the white of the paper to function as my light source. Oh, sorry, we go forward. The Prairie is some place, it's a landscape that I discovered quite late, only about 12 years ago, and although I don't get out into the Great Western Prairie as much as I do, the times that I've been there, it's just been such an extraordinary experience that it's really stuck with me. I just am really taken with the amount of wildlife that one can experience in such an open place. And I really love cut bank streams that go and meander through the landscape. And it's provided me with an endless amount of material to work with. Valleys and fields are another subject matter. This painting I did after a trip I took with my family in Burgundy, and we traveled along the Via Agrippa, which ran from Autun in southern Burgundy to basically to Rome. There's a straight line that runs kind of in a diagonal through the left. That's the Via Agrippa. And it was just an amazing, incredible landscape. It's obviously highly, highly organized with years and years and years of farming. So it has a very non-random structure to it, which I really loved. I loved the patterns in that part of France. They really, really took me. So now I'm going to start with mountains as an overview. In terms of my time in the mountains, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Tetons because I have a lot of friends whose kids have ended up moving and living there. So we've gone out to lots of weddings, and I've been there skiing quite a bit. And I did my first group of paintings of these mountains after I was out there, and my son and I were going to take a day hike, and it was a crystal clear morning, and we were driving down to go in by this area called Jenny Lake, which is kind of the central part of the Tetons from the eastern side. And as we were driving towards where we were going to start our hike, all of a sudden the blue sky went away, and this very eerie scrim of gray and then kind of brown light started to come in through the atmosphere, and the sunlight was shining through it. And there were lots of fires in Idaho, southern Idaho, at this time period. And how the landscape was entirely transformed in about 20 minutes gave me the subject matter for at least 15 paintings. And it was just remarkable to see how something so majestic could be so apocalyptic, really, in that amount of time. So I did a series of paintings of that particular morning, and this is one of them. And I can't remember exactly what mountain that is. Whether there's a mountain called Tiwanaut, and I think that was that particular piece. This is a painting that I did based on a memory of being in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The one thing that you find, particularly in northern western states right now, is there's a combination of two things that have happened. There's something called the birch bark beetle that is taking out most of the Douglas fir, and then so you're left with a lot of material for fires to work with. So you have these burned forests that butt up against living forests. So you get these kind of interesting layers, and when the light cuts across them, it almost looks like it's a combination of, you think that you're looking at hardwood trees in the fall with the leaves down, but they're all softwoods that have either experienced the birch bark beetle, or they've experienced the birch bark beetle with fire. And this mountain, I think, was called Slate Goat Mountain, and we did a hike up to the top of that peak. Anyway, it's a really great one, and my father owns this particular painting, so I see it quite a lot. It was a good one. This also came out of the fire paintings. And I had done some in a square format, and I felt like I needed more of a vertical push to express how the light was functioning, and particularly in the Tetons, because they are all about upward lift. So I ended up doing a lot of verticals. And then this last one is of a memory of skiing climbing in British Columbia. Quite often when you're climbing up fairly high and close to the summit of any particular peak, you have something called there are these wind-loaded slabs, and they create cornices, and they can be 40 to 50 feet high, just a cornice of snow that's been deposited by the wind. So at the very top, on the upper left, you see this kind of white line. As you're climbing up and the light hits these cornices, that it creates a striation that goes on forever. If the light hits right and you're seeing 10 or 11 mountains, you're seeing multiple cornices at different distances and layers. And I found the image to be very striking. So I made that painting about it. Vernal pools and ponds around where we live in Vermont. There are these ephemeral spring pools called vernal pools that occur usually in where you have two little hillsides creating kind of a cup, and that cup will hold snow melt, and they're great areas for salamanders and frogs to breed, and they are, I find, very interesting subjects to work with. This is a pond. This is the pond actually down below my house, not the one I showed you a picture of. This is a picture of the pond across from my house, as I remembered walking down across and seeing this incredible V of color that was particularly striking to me. And so this particular V that occurs there with the light as this kind of beacon, that was the inspiration for making that particular piece. That was definitely in the late afternoon. Yeah. Oop. And this is of a vernal pool. I'm sorry, it's a lousy image. But the vernal pools I just find so fascinating because they're filled with ferns and sticks and rocks and all kinds of stuff. And then you've got a lot of life as well. And usually close by a vernal pool there are rock outcroppings or something. There has to be something to keep the water in. And this is probably, I think, the best image that I made of a vernal pool. It's kind of too bad it's such a crappy image. And finally, this is probably, the ode to the Great Meadows in many ways, or my memories of being on the Concord River as a kid. I didn't go out to make the painting about the Concord River, but I remember finishing this painting and thinking, oh, that reminds me a lot of floating down the Concord River as a kid in a canoe. So a lot of the work, I actually, in my current show right now, I have a painting that I titled Alberg, because when I was in 5th grade, my parents in their wisdom decided to take their 3 unruly kids to Austria to go skiing. And I think we destroyed a couple hotel rooms when we were there. But I was making paintings of mountains, and I thought, why not make a painting of the Alberg? So I in my current show, I actually have a painting of my memory of what the Alberg Mountains were from 5th grade. So I do project back. I don't just do what I've seen in the recent past. And then another subject matter that I'm particularly interested in are trails that go through the forests, or outcrops, or drainages, or rocks. Cellar holes are particularly interesting. Where my camp is, the cabin is in Vermont. It's in the town of Hancock, Vermont, and between Hancock and Rochester, Vermont, there was a town called Philadelphia, Vermont, which doesn't exist anymore. Philadelphia is a lost town that was extremely hard scrabble. It must have been amazingly difficult to live. It's up high. It's north-facing largely, so a pretty formidable place to have one ox and and maybe some sheep. And I think the last people to live there were around 1908, 1909. But what's left behind now is this incredibly interesting forest that you'll be walking in the middle of a classic kind of hardwood forest or a spruce forest, and then you'll come upon apple trees, and there'll be bloodroot on the ground, and then you start to see sheepfolds and other structures, and then cellar holes, and then barn, obviously piers for barns. And I'm just fascinated by the compression of time, the idea that someone lived in this particular area and made a go of it and left their mark, and then having it sit empty and fallow, and then coming upon it and trying to express my understanding for that lost bit of time. This painting is very specifically of the hiking trails that I experienced in Acadia, and in particular, there is one trail, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but the entire thing is made up of laid up rocks. So there was a trail crew back at the turn of the century that made this incredible staircase of rocks, and I just was so absolutely blown away by how beautiful the climb was, that I ended up making a lot of paintings based on the memory of doing that. And I went back here many days in a row just to walk on it. It's a really magical place. This also was from Acadia. On the way to that walkway, the guy that gave me the residency there, he told me about an old cedar swamp that was uncut, so a virgin cedar swamp with virgin trees, which I had never seen on the East Coast. I had never seen an uncut cedar forest, and it's off the trail. You have to go digging around for it, and I found it after a couple days of looking for it, and the ground is nothing but sphagnum moss that when you walk into it, you sink into almost your knees of sphagnum moss. It was just amazing. And I went there and laid down one afternoon on my back, and it was one of these beautiful days, and I just kind of let the world go by me, and that this is what this painting is about. It was a really good painting of a really good memory. It's just an absolutely magical place. This is my meadow at my cabin. I've done a bunch of paintings of that meadow, and this is a relatively large piece, it's really about the kind of transience of light and time, a particular time of day, a memory of that time of day, of the early morning mist burning off with the sunlight as it's coming up over the ridge. With this particular painting, I think I had read a book that talked about this type of light, and it brought back the memory of being in the meadow. And we have a tree in the meadow that we call Beethoven, because he looks just like Beethoven. So that is actually Beethoven right there. It's our tree. And then this is, I wanted to put this up as a kind of complete contrast to that last painting, which was really about the kind of transience and transparency of form, to something that I also really like to do, which is to look at the edge of the forest. There's something in forestry called the edge effect, and when you do a clear cut, for instance, to harvest wood, you're creating a new edge of the woods, and what happens to that edge is vulnerable because the treetops hold each other in. the crown of a tree is just like the root structure of a tree. So as much as the roots are holding a tree straight up, so is the crown, because the crown is touching the crown of an adjacent tree. So as the wind blows, the trees are kept up by the surrounding trees. And when you cut a line across that, you're creating something called the edge effect. So trees start to fall down. And that has a good and bad effect. The good effect is that when those trees fall down, it creates regeneration. The bad part about that is that it opens up, particularly for drainage, for water resource issues. If you clear cut something, you're causing a lot of problems with the quality of the water that's being held in the ground. So I do a lot of paintings of this edge, of the forest edge, and they tend to almost be kind of like cross sections. And I am fascinated by trees. I'm fascinated by how trees relate to one another and how they function, the various stories of a tree, from the lowest story from a shrub in the woods to the highest crown of a maple or an ash tree. And then again, this is back to my meadow, so it's a good contrast on both sides to look at that again and to get another look at Beethoven, who's on the left this time. And then the last, I think that this is the last group of the subject matter, valleys, fields, and hills. And what I said at the beginning of my talk is that I live in a real storybook landscape. And the landscape particularly I think in Windsor County, Vermont, which is the county that I live in, has, to me, as a kid growing up and reading Winnie the Pooh, the 9-acre forest, fields and hedgerows and trees and farming, it has all of that and more. And I am particularly interested in trying to paint that landscape without making it a pastiche, without just reproducing it as is, and trying to find the kind of the magic and the interplay that does truly exist in some of these extraordinary places that still do exist. This one in particular, I think I called this the celestial forest. To me, sometimes when I look down on a series of trees and fields, and it's as intricate and beautiful as lying down and looking at the stars at night. There's multiple satellites that exist to me in a green space as there is in the night sky. This also, I'm interested in what happens in the atmosphere as well. This is just kind of a classic thunderhead that I responded to. This is a valley, a memory of a valley on a drive that we took when I was in France. I was really taken by the French forests, which are largely oak, and then how right next to the forest you can have this viticulture, the winemaking that is just so prevalent, and how these two parts of their agrarian world coincide with one another is really amazing, because the French are really proud of their forests, and I just, not knowing that until I went and really looked carefully, they have an amazing forested resource. In particular, I think in this region of Burgundy, which was news to me. This is a fairly typical image of something that I probably responded to a type of light that happened rising up from the hills, and trying to conjure up a memory of a time of day, of the breakup of a front, a cloud front, and trying to integrate it with its relationship with the form of the landscape. So I tried to create these kind of within the landscape there is a formal relationship between the shapes of the trees and the shapes of the clouds, as an integrated form. Another one similar to a painting that I showed before. It's a good one to kind of grasp, and maybe I'll walk up and talk about this more specifically. So right here, all of this stuff, like the trees themselves, were all taken away. So that was a solid block of paint, and I would have pulled the paint off to reveal the form that, in my mind's eye, existed underneath. It's as if those things truly exist when I put the painting on, but they don't happen until I start to take away. So that's the subtractive part that I was talking about earlier, just as a better understanding of that. And then this is the last set of subject matter. The one thing that I didn't mention is that I spent a lot of time in the 90s in Ireland. I got a grant to go stay at a residency on the west coast of Ireland in County Mayo, which is a very remote place, beautiful. And after I was there for a period of time, I ended up being asked to teach in the local high school, which I did, which was a real experience. I was the only Yank to ever teach in this school, and I was really, the students really took it to me. It was a really fun time. But so from 1987 until the last time I went was 2007, I've had a long going relationship with this particular Mayo coastline, and I have not made a painting since 2007 based on County Mayo, but if I go back again I certainly will. This I think is Lake Michigan. It's a particularly good one. I really like that piece. I think that was probably from Maine, being in Maine. The interesting thing about being on the water or being on the coast looking at the water is that I am always immediately disoriented. I don't truly understand where the horizon begins or ends, and there's a lot of conflicting imagery that I'm experiencing all at once. And when I make a painting, I try to create that sense of vertigo that I experience when I am around the ocean. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It usually has to do with light and where the light source is coming from. This is also kind of a classic headland on the Mayo coast. This particular, I was really taken with this particular area because there is a road that goes, they call them famine roads, which were constructed to keep the indentured people busy during the famine. And this was just an incredibly interesting turn in the coastline. This is also kind of classic brooding Mayo coast. It's not known for its majesty, but it's known for its kind of blunt, it's raw, blunt. And a lot of people, I think there's a lot of depression there, and I think there are probably a lot of suicides that happen there too. It's a tough place to live. This particular memory, I remember the day that I was inspired to make this painting. There were, I think, 4 bands of snow that came through, and then followed by sunlight, and then snow, and then wind, and then sunlight, and it created this, because of the temperature inversion, it created this incredible thing right along the edge of the cliffs. There was this clinging mist that hung onto the edge of the cliffs that was really quite extraordinary. I've also done these two paintings, both this painting and this piece, are largely about kind of the loss of an understanding of where the water begins or where it ends. It's a subject matter that I go back to over and over again. I don't think I've really truly answered the question in my mind's eye. So I sometimes, like this last group of paintings I made, I thought that I would go back to the same subject. I got halfway through the painting and I got rid of it because it wasn't happening. This one, essentially looks just like a skyscape, but there is water in there down at the bottom that's slowly drifting up into that kind of amorphous mist. So the foothills, prairies, and the Front Range. This is going back to the butte that we saw before. This is one of these small paintings. This is only 12 by 24 inches. And in that very small painting, I pack a lot of information, a lot of space. Essentially, that's the entire northern Front Range out of the town of Augusta in Montana that I managed to squeeze into that one little painting. I think I have a couple other, that one's back to the butte again. The trees that you see there's a stream that travels through the grasslands. So those are all cottonwood trees. This is another part of the Montana front. Earlier, this is a springtime shot. This is later in the summer, same area. It's called the Scapegoat Wilderness in the Lewis and Clark National Forest, as I recall. It's the same place, but higher up on the hill. These were all taken from a sketchbook that I made drawings of. This is the body of water. It's called Smith Creek that goes through the prairie. So if you were in the creek bed and you turn the corner there on the left, you'd be looking at that group of mountains of the prior painting. So it's really a neat, amazing place because the prairie just bumps right up against the mountains. And then this last group is based largely on a book that I read by a guy by the name of Robert McFarland, who has a book that is incredible processing of his own personal understanding of what mountains mean in kind of a Western cultural context, from the time that Hannibal tried to cross the Alps to our present-day mountain climbers who are attempting first climbs on unclimbed mountains, from our obsession with Everest to our obsession with understanding of possibly the other. And the mountains, to me, are always a place that I look on first with awe, and then I want to kind of peel back that awe and understand what is it about that in my subconscious that is continually drawn to the form. And so I'm not trying to create any answers to these questions. I've just been making paintings based on my memories of these places to kind of bring back a better understanding for what they mean to me. So they're all of these pieces are actually on paper. So they're 30 inches by 22 inches. And they're all, I love to look out the window of airplanes when I fly over mountains. So a lot of these are just memories of flying over mountains. I think this is the last of that. So then finally, I thought it would be really informative for you all to look at a couple painters that I have really enjoyed getting to know in my later years. These are artists that I never would have looked at when I was in undergraduate school or even as a graduate student, maybe one as a graduate student, but people who I've come to understand much better kind of in my middle age as a painter. Rockwell Kent, many of you might know, was from New York State. He was an amazing graphic artist who produced etchings, wood etchings and wood engravings for all the major magazines, American magazines. And he was also a really great painter. He was a bit of a scoundrel, apparently, as well. I think this particular piece is of Monhegan. I just grabbed books that I had, and I took snapshots of these the other day. So they're not great reproductions. And you might see some fold in them, because they're just taken out of these books. But you know, Rockwell Kent, I think, is an American artist that's not been given his due. He was someone that traveled through the Arctic and painted outdoors in the Arctic in these incredible environments. And even though he was, for me, it's such an incredible thing, because when I look at his paintings, I see this real amazing spiritual response to these fantastic landscapes that he was experiencing. It's something that for a guy who was so graphically talented and structurally oriented, he somehow overcame that and was able to allow a really wonderful emotional response to the landscape to get by his predilection to be overly graphic, if that makes any sense. George Innes, I'm sure many of you know. I just love his paintings. Whenever I can see a piece of his, I will go. There's some great paintings of his in town collections, in libraries, throughout New York State, in small museums, and in large museums. The last time I saw a group of his work was in Williamstown at a great show that was about kind of transcendental painters. He's someone that I continually go back to. I think he was far ahead of his time in terms of how the picture plane functions. To me, his paintings are quite flat and atmospheric, yet there's an incredible amount of depth within this kind of flat layup of the paint. And I think he just painted these paintings almost to death. I think they're heavily, heavily painted. Many layers. Lauren Harris is probably entirely unknown in the United States. He was a Canadian painter who painted in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. He was from Toronto, and again, he's someone that I think found a real incredible connection to the land, and made these very, very, very evocative paintings of really fantastic landforms. Edward Steichen is more known for his photography, but he was from Luxembourg, and he came to America. He was trained as a painter, and then quickly jumped on to photography. But there was this golden period where he was making photographs and paintings at the same time. And I was lucky enough to see a show of his paintings. Hard to see his work, hard to see his paintings. And was really, really struck by how incredibly beautiful and atmospheric, and also strangely photographic, all of his work is. And I do really also love his early photography, his landscape-oriented photography. Paul Strand, another well-known American photographer, is someone that I continually try to find images to see in person. The Met in New York has a great collection of his work. The National Gallery has a really incredible collection of his work as well. I think these all might be from the National Gallery. This is just an amazingly beautiful seascape. This is a French landscape. I really, really love his use of texture and tonality. I can continually go back and look at his work. Martin Johnson Heade is an American painter. Many of you might know him. These are of the Newbury marshes, paintings that he did of the Newbury marshes, the Essex River. He's a bit of a quirky painter, but I really, really love his work. The MFA in Boston has a lot of his paintings, and they did a retrospective of his maybe about 10 years ago that I went and saw. And I think I'd only seen one of his paintings prior to that. And I just love his use of dramatic light. And again, his work is quite unusual. It's kind of otherworldly. Gustav Klimt is a great Austrian painter, more known for his figure work, but also painted amazing landscapes, and his use of pattern and light and color are all things that I continually look at. And then this guy, Ferdinand Hodler, was a Swedish painter who was a huge influence on Klimt. And Hodler, you really will only see his work in I think I've only seen his work in Switzerland, at the Modern Museum in Zurich. Has an amazing collection of his paintings. And I remember being so struck when I saw them, when I got out of college and I took a trip traveling, kind of hitchhiking and getting on trains throughout Europe. And my advisor in college was a Klimt. He wrote his dissertation, his PhD, on Gustav Klimt, and he had told me about Ferdinand Hodler, and I had never seen his pictures, and so I knew the bulk of his collection was in Zurich, so we went to see this work, and I remembered it really well. And then I remember maybe about 14 years ago, my mom said, well, we're going to be in Zurich, and I said, would you please buy me a Hodler catalog? So this is out of that catalog, and his paintings are really, really great. He has an incredible sense of color, and I was telling Meg most recently that a lot of the work that I'm doing right now has been incredibly influenced by his kind of amped up hues that he uses. I think this is a painting maybe of Lake Geneva. And I just love his work. He's really, really, really great and completely unknown in this country. The later paintings of Gustave Courbet, not a lot of people realize that he really became a landscape painter in the latter portion of his life. A lot of the paintings are horrible. They're really garish and heavily painted and overdone. But there are a lot of really, really good paintings. He did some beautiful seascapes. And so he's someone that I've given a second look to as well. And then I was introduced to this gentleman, a German painter, when I was in graduate school. For whatever reason, I was making abstract paintings, and the guy who was the head of our program told me that I should look at Caspar David Friedrich, and I had never heard of him. So I did. I was in New York and I bought a book on him, and I thought, oh gosh, I got to see this work somehow. And there are a few paintings in this country that I've gotten to see. The amazing thing is, like those little paintings that I made, his paintings are about this big, and they're of these just gigantic and triumphant landscapes It's really it's like listening to, the Beethoven's third or Beethoven's fifth, is like looking at one of these paintings. They're really incredible. There's a lot of horns and a lot of strings, and I find his use of light and his sense of design and his prowess. When you look at these paintings, literally every single little needle on the tree is painted in, and it's extraordinary. And this is another one. It's just a fabulous painting. So that is what I have for you. I will just leave you with two more things. When I make a painting, quite oftentimes I will either try to conjure up a memory, or I will read, and there will be something that I read that hits me in a particular way, and I will take a phrase or a word or an image that I will take from a poem or something that I've read, and I'll try to start the painting process that way. And one person that I do that consistently with is this guy by the name of Charles Wright, who was our poet laureate at one point. He taught at UVA. He was actually the advisor of one of my old students, and I remember talking to her, and she said, well, you should write him. He's really approachable. He's a great guy. And so I wrote him, and he wrote me back a great letter, and I wrote him back again, and then he wrote me back another great letter. And so he and I have shared letters for the past 14 or 15 years. And it's been a really serendipitous and wonderful relationship. And then there's just one more writer. I mentioned The Mountains of the Mind by Robert Macfarlane. This is his most recent book called Landmarks, which he wrote in response to the Oxford Dictionary dropping a lot of words out of kind of the natural world. So words that had to do with rocks or a type of bird or the way a type of sunlight or anything like that, they were Xing. And so what he decided to do, he calls this book a word hoard. And so he splits the book up into different sections. One is on field, one is on mountains, one is on forest, kind of the same way that I did split my images up. And at the end of each chapter, which he refers to a lot of writers, is a full index of words that he culled together and created to keep them going. It's a absolutely wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Very readable and really fun. So I'm going to leave you with one last image, which my daughter took of me. She dressed me up in green and put me underneath this after one of her ski races. But that pretty much sums up my life right there. And this has been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.